As you are taking your seat this morning, let's return to our time with the study of the Word as we look at Revelation chapter 8 again this morning. We're going to be looking really particularly at verses 8 through 13 as we conclude chapter 8. Now, just remember, as we've come to chapter 8, there's a new section that we are in the book of Revelation. And it's really the third sections. There are 7 sections we've talked about. We don't need to rehearse those and go over those again. But there are actually 7 sections in that book. And the first section is chapters 1 to 3, which has to do with the church. And the second section has to do in chapters 4 through 7 with the seals that were opened as the Lord showed us he was going to take the world back that is rightfully his. And he was going to set up his rule and his reign. And now we come to the third section, and it goes from chapter 8 all the way to chapter 11. And it's important for you as you come to this section to remember that the symbol or the picture that grabs our mind should be trumpets. Just like in the second section there were 7 seals, here in this section, chapters 8 through 11, there are going to be 7 trumpets that we are going to hear as they sound, and they sound things that are very important for us to hear as we think about the end times, as we think about the return of Christ, and just how God has handed down this truth to us so that we would not be ignorant, we wouldn't be unwise, that we would not be as those who don't know the truth about the coming of Christ again. Now, as you come to chapter 8, remember just in verse 1, a very important setting here is it says that when the Lamb broke the 7th seal, remember there's 6 of them, when he finally broke the last seal in chapter 8, verse 1, that 7th seal says, there was silence in heaven for about a half an hour, and I saw the 7 angels who stand before God, and 7 trumpets were given to them. And that kind of sets the setting and the stage for us here, because everywhere up to this point in the book of Revelation, there has been nothing but noise in heaven. There has been constant praise to God, flashes of lightning and thunder. Saints are singing and worshiping God night and day. The cries of the martyrs in heaven are asking the Lord, how much longer is it going to be till you go and you return and you establish all that the prophets have given to us? There's all this singing and worship and praising until you come to chapter 8, and then there's just this quietness. And as we learned last week, this quietness is a way of causing us to really just contemplate for just a moment something very important. When quietness here comes, it's alerting us that something is up, just like I told you last week. When your children get quiet, you know something is up. And just like, whenever there's like no noise, you're always going, what's going on? Something's up. And so there's silence, and this quietness here does alert us and causes us to lean forward in a hushed kind of anticipation that God is going to say something when he speaks to us through these trumpets. And so the scene in chapter 8, verses 1 through 6 is up in heaven. Remember, there are prayers that are being offered in heaven. There are angels who stand before God. And this is obviously a reminder to the church, again, that there are the people of God already in heaven. And there are prayers that are going on, and there are prayers on earth that are happening. And here we see, as we saw last week, that they are offering their prayers to the Lord. They're crying out to him. And really that grabbed heaven's attention for that moment and caused it to just be silent. And as I thought about that this week, I was just remembering and thinking through Old Testament imagery of how whenever prayer in the Old Testament was offered up, it was like an incense that would go up. It was a sweet aroma to God. It smelled, as it were, very sweet to him. It caught his attention. He noticed it. And so when these prayers are being offered up in verses 1 through 4 there's literally this sense in which God has given special attention to those prayers. Heaven is silent. There is quietness. They are waiting to see what God is going to do about those prayers that have been offered up to him. Now listen very carefully. This is something that I think if you just put the whole book in context really kind of excites me. Because I think about how the book opened in the first section with the early church, those 7 small little congregations there. And the question you might be thinking, and maybe they were thinking in their mind here, is what good is a little church going to do in such a dark world? I mean, they are lights in the world. They are looked at as a candlestick that he's evaluating. But what good are they going to do? How are they going to really ultimately see anything happen in their world? How strong can the church really be against Greece or against Rome or against any political power? I mean, realistically. And that's why it always bugs me when the church kind of steps away from its first and foremost calling, which is making the gospel known, and it goes over here and it becomes another voice in the political arena to just shout about politics. I mean, what good is the church going to do in that battle? It's just another voice. Now, you know me, vote your conscience, vote your convictions. I do the same thing. You should do that. It's part of the common grace of God that we have in American culture that lets us voice our opinion. But I've said to you this before, if that common grace of God is removed and we're like other cultures and other places and we don't have a voice, then who are you going to count on? Who are you going to trust in to change the world around you? Well, this early church was in that condition like that where they realized, listen, we don't have a voice in the government. We don't have any political options to really exercise our convictions and our thoughts. So I guess what we better do is pray. Isn't that an interesting reminder? We'll just pray. I guess that's what we have to do. And that is what we do. Because it is when we pray, you remember, that heaven is silenced and they begin to listen to what God is going to do because his people are on the earth are crying out to him. Listen, when Israel was in its bondage and it couldn't free itself from the difficulty it was in, it cried out to God, and God sent the prophet Moses to them and said, you tell them that I've actually heard their cry. Whenever the church prayed in the New Testament for Peter to be set free when he was locked up and they had no way they could get him out, he heard their prayer. And we don't want to underestimate this important thing called prayer. And listen, you don't want to underestimate the importance of teaching your children to pray. Because when you teach your children to pray, you're not just teaching them good manners and developing good character in them. You know what you're doing? You're teaching them that there's a God in heaven who, when you pray, everything gets quiet and he listens. You're telling them that when you pause to give thanks for your food, God hears what you're saying. You're telling them that when you start on a trip and you pray that God will be with you and guide you, he is listening to you. And you are teaching them that when you pray for God to hear for those who are lost to be saved and to come and to know Christ, he's hearing it. And so, when we on this earth, like the early church and just like churches from centuries since the first century have struggled with, how do we deal with this struggle we find ourselves in? How do we deal with coming trouble in our world? Well, the solution is we begin to pray. We begin to lift our voices to him, just like we read in Revelation 8, verses 1 through 6, because God is about to answer. Did you notice in verse 5 what it says? Then the angel took the censer and filled it with fire of the altar and threw it to the earth. Watch this. It's like it's a picture of God saying, okay, I've got your prayer, now I'm going to answer. He threw it to the earth. In fact, as we read our text in just a moment in verses 8 through 13, that phrase keeps being used over and over again. Look at verse 7. And they were thrown to the earth. Verse 8, and they were thrown into the sea. And in verse 10, and they fell from heaven. As these trumpets begin to sound, it's as if God's way of saying, listen very carefully, I'm about to answer your prayer, and it's in the picture of him throwing some things down upon the earth. And those 7 trumpets are directly from God. They come from him. They are announcing some judgment that is about to come. Now, when we come to these trumpets and we get ready to look at these this morning, I want you to think in terms of a connection that goes not only with the seals, but with also these judgment bowls that are coming later on in the book of Revelation. Maybe this little image here can kind of help you think about what these seals and trumpets and bowls are like. Remember, there are 7 seals, and when the 7th seal opened in chapter 8, verse 1, then it's going to show us 7 trumpets that are going to open. And when the seventh trumpet ends and it blows, it will again open up 7 bowls of judgment. And so there's a real connection that goes on in these 3 different sets of 7s. And you might be asking yourself, well, if they're 3 sets of 7, what are they doing? Aren't they telling us something of the same thing? Well, in one sense, yes. Because when you read the 7 seals, you read about tribulations and trials coming to the earth. And when you get to that final 7th seal, we saw Christ return, or 6th seal, we saw Christ returning. And when you open up these 7 seals, you're going to see, or trumpets rather, you're going to see that it is again going to tell us the same story over again, but it's going to add something unique to that story. In other words, you'll be reading things in chapters 8 through 11, and you're going to say, that sounds very similar to what we read back in chapters 5 and 6. These judgments look so similar. And they do. And in fact, when you get to the bowls, you're going to read things and you're going to say, they look very, very similar. So it's almost like saying this, when John saw that 7th seal open, contained in that 7th seal are going to be 7 trumpets and 7 bowls. And in fact, it contains everything we're ultimately needing to know about this period called the tribulation period and the trouble that is coming to the world and what it looks like when Christ returns. So let me show you one other little chart before we jump right into the passage here and just show you what I mean by in this 3rd cycle. And then when we get to the 5th cycle and we start looking at the bowls of wrath in chapters 15 and 16, you'll see that they are almost identical. The first trumpet blows and it affects the earth, just as well as the first bowl, when it's poured out, it affects the earth. The second trumpet affects the seas, so does the second bowl. The third affects the rivers as it blows that trumpet, and so does the third bowl. And right on down through all 7 of these. And at the end of each of these, whether it's the seals, the trumpets, or the bowls, what you find is another picture that refers to the second coming of Christ. Now, you say, well, Pastor Kevin, we should get through chapters 8 through 11 really fast because we've already studied all this stuff, right? And the answer is you're absolutely right. My anticipation is we'll be all the way through chapter 11 in about 4 messages, whereas we spent 13 on that second section. We've unpacked really things that go on in the tribulation, and we've looked at things that really preclude the coming of Christ when he comes again and his church rises in the rapture to meet him, and they are gathered and they return with him for him to establish his glorious kingdom and set up his reign forever and ever that we were singing about this morning. But you say, well then, if these trumpets and bowls and seals all keep telling the same thing, why do we hear 3 different things? Why do we have 3 different images here? Why do we have seals and then trumpets and then bowls? Well, here's what I did in my Bible, and I think it helps me to understand this in this way. Though they are telling the same storyline, as that progression of the story keeps building and telling it over and over again and adding things to it, there is something unique that is added with the trumpets and that is different than the seals. In my Bible, I wrote above chapter 6 and 7 that the 7 seals remind me of the protection of God's people. Now listen very carefully. When that tribulation comes, and we've really not seen us escaping the tribulation and trials that will come, when it comes, that the passages that we looked at in chapters 6 and 7 about the breaking of the seals, there's this reminder that we are being protected by God. So that section, as you think about the tribulation period and you think about the troubles and the trials that are coming, what it should do for you is make you as a child of God, as the people of God, know that there is a sense in which we are very comforted that God will protect us. In fact, he's promised that he would save us from the wrath that will come on the world. He will rescue us just in the nick of time. And as he does, and as we go to meet him, we are saved. So when we think about the different seals, those are reminders that we are protected, we are kept safe because we are sealed by God. In fact, don't you remember Paul telling us that we, the believers, are sealed until the day of redemption? So when that final day of redemption and him gathering us to himself, we are going to be saved because we have been sealed by the Holy Spirit. We are the people of God. So yes, when we read about these 6 seals being broken and judgment coming in the world, and then finally God's wrath pouring out, we are rescued, we are protected, and that is comforting. Now here's what I wrote in my Bible when I came to chapters 8 through 11. If the 7 seals spoke of protection, and that's what it reminds us of as God's people in the midst of tribulation time, chapters 8 through 11, which speak about the 7 trumpets, remind us of punishment. You see, it's the same story. There is tribulation, there is trials coming, but there is going to be, in these trumpets here, the unprotected. Not only are God's people going to be safe, but those who are not God's people, they are not going to be safe. And so there is no comfort for them in chapters 8 through 11. In fact, the focus of the chapter there is really going to be on all the woes that are coming upon the earth. So when we think of tribulation, if you want to hear the first part of the stories, chapters 4 through 6, or 7 rather, which talk about those seals, think of comfort. If you think of chapters 8 through 11 and the trumpets, think of the warnings of judgment that is to come. Now those trumpets are also, as it comes to the 7th one, going to be a great reminder to us to be watching and to be looking for the return of Christ. So, as we think about these trumpets this morning, I want us to read verses 7 down through verse 13 and walk you through this text here. After these 7 angels in heaven are given these 7 trumpets and they're about ready to blow them, they prepared themselves, it says in verse 6 for it. Verse 7 says, the first sounded, and there came hail and fire mixed with blood, and they were thrown to the earth. And 1/3 of the earth was burned up, and 1/3 of the trees were burned up, and all the green grass was burned up. The second angel sounded, and something like a great mountain burning with fire was thrown into the sea. And 1/3 of the sea became blood, and 1/3 of the creatures which were in the sea and had life died, and 1/3 of the ships were destroyed. The third angel sounded, and a great star fell from heaven, burning like a torch, and it fell on the 1/3 of the rivers and on the springs of waters. The name of the star is called Wormwood, and 1/3 of the waters became wormwood, and many men died from the waters because they were bitter. The fourth angel sounded, and 1/3 of the sun, 1/3 of the moon, and 1/3 of the stars were struck, so that 1/3 of them would be darkened, and the day would not shine for 1/3 of it, and the night in the same way. Then I looked, and I heard an eagle flying in mid-heaven, saying with a loud voice, "Woe, woe, woe to those who dwell on the earth because of the remaining blast of the trumpet of the 3 angels who are about to sound." So you can see the context immediately. It doesn't become one of comfort for God's people. It is the call to them to be aware that woe is coming, judgment is about to fall. Now, I want you to notice something that's very interesting about the first 4 trumpets. They come very fast, right? Just like the first 4 seals were broken quickly, and those 4 horses came running in, galloping, quickly bringing their destruction, these 4 trumpets are blown rather quickly. And this trouble that has come now is going to be like just one upon the other. Now there's another thing I think you should note as we look at these first 4 trumpets this morning here, is that these first 4 trumpets focus on the earth. Everything about this has to do with the earth. The earth is scorched, the waters, the sun, the moon, all those things related to the earth. They are all about things going on in the earth. But you need to note something I think is so important to this section here. You remember that when we studied the first 4 seals, how those horses came riding in? It was telling us about things that were going on in the earth. Remember, war came, famine and floods and death. It's things going on in the world. But now watch this very carefully. These first 4 trumpets are not about things going on in the world. They are things going on with and through the world, the created world. In other words, when we think about the tribulation, yes, there are things going on in the world. There's war, there's famine, there's death, there's floods, all those things that we saw in the seals. But when you come to the trumpets now, literally, it is actually the elements themselves that are being used as instruments of wrath and judgment. So it's not just about what's happening in the earth. It's literally what's going on with the earth as it is actually being used as an instrument in God's hand. So we're going to look at this chapter real quickly with 2 thoughts here. And we're going to think of it in terms of the day is coming when there is going to be no more Earth Day. No more Earth Day. Now, the reason I chose that title is because I think it's not hard for us to come to a conclusion that we live in a day in which there's a lot of people who worship the earth. They worship the creation. They worship the creation rather than the Creator. It's Romans 1 all over again. And I don't want you to misunderstand me as we kind of set the stage here for these things where the world starts being used as an instrument of judgment to think that we shouldn't take care of our world. But what I want you to understand is that we live in a day when people have gone way beyond stewardship to worship. And they have now not just really tried to take care of the things, knowing that God himself gave them to us, but they've forgotten all about the Creator, and they've bowed down, and they have worshiped, and they have adored the creation. That's what they have done. Since the very first Earth Day, back in 1970, its goal has remained the same. And here's what those who buy into that approach to our world have to say. Their goal is to raise the awareness of millions of people around the world to the plight of the planet and the need for humankind to save the earth. You see, it shows up in so many ways. It shows up in promoting green economic policies at home and abroad, environmental education through conferences and seminars and TVs. And even now our schools are often referred to as green schools. A recent ABC News forum increased a growing sense of panic as statements were made and why we need to take serious these seminars and these approaches to our world. They wrote, quote, "We really have less than a decade to start getting this right. If we're still dragging our feet, 10 years from now, it will become almost impossible for the world to avert intolerable consequences." It came from a forum called the ABC News Forum on Surviving the Century. In one of its teaching curriculums from the Earth Day movement, you can go onto their website, you can read everything you want to read about it. But one of its teachings curriculum for public schools says, quote, "We just need to learn how to do everything we can to serve Mother Nature and save the earth." Now listen very carefully. I'm not telling you should take your kids out of public school. That's not my goal and my thought behind this at all. It's not even saying we shouldn't try to make things as environmentally safe as we can. I'm not telling you that at all. But I'm telling you this, that we live in a day and time where Earth Day has become a worship moment rather than it is a stewardship moment. And we live in a culture and a day in which people really begin to think in terms of how they are going to rescue plants and animals and the ozone and everything around us, as if that is really the greatest concern. And at the heart of that, it really has become, I think, the number one political correct idol of our world. We're to take care of Mother Earth, they tell us. It's paramount. If we don't, something is going to happen to it and therefore us. Now, if the world thought this way, I really wouldn't be shocked, right? Because here's a people who don't know God, who don't know the Creator, and they live in fear and panic when they see things in the world falling apart. So all they have to do is try to figure out some way to save it. And I get that for lost people. Here's where I don't get it, is where it becomes a platform in the professing church. One article I recently read dealt with the fact that many denominations now and world religions are joining together over this issue. The headline blazed with these words, Earth Day, something we can all believe in. It then went on to talk about how all faith systems of the world are uniting to save the planet. The article also happened to show the president of the National Association of Evangelicals holding the microphone, standing next to a Muslim and a rabbi. All of these faith leaders were encouraging pastors and priests of every religion to, listen, sign Earth Day Network's global warming in the pulpit pledge. I agree with part of that. I think there ought to be some warming in the pulpit. Well, that's the only part. I would agree with that. There should be some fire and some convictions coming from a pulpit. I went on and looked, and they've actually provided for you sermons ready to preach with titles like Penguins and Polar Bears and People Too, or Passover and the Global Climate Crisis. Now, this is the one that really struck me as like, I can't believe. They literally took the Passover and twisted all the elements of the Passover in the Old Testament, which is a story of redemption and someone dying in your place so God could forgive you. And they twisted it in and referred to it as ecology and global warming issues. In fact, one Presbyterian pastor chose to ban styrofoam cups to join in the fight to save the earth. The pastor went on to complain, quote, much of where we turn to for wisdom on environmental issues is precisely the same source that underlies evolution. And then he added, that's posed a difficulty for some churches, I reckon. Without riding this bandwagon too long, some churches in Maryland have now started creating an association to, quote, establish earth healing ministries to revere and cherish the earth. So obviously, when we come to this passage, we've just got to address this issue of the worship of earth. And here's what I think is the irony of the whole passage. Simple to understand. But the irony of the passage is that in the tribulation period, now as we're thinking about what is it going to mean to those who don't know God, we know what it means to us who do know God, who are sealed and protected, and we make it safely through that tribulation, and we're raptured to be caught up with the Lord as he returns to establish his kingdom. But what does it mean to those who don't know him during that period and when he comes again? Listen very, very carefully. In this process, as each trumpet is blowing, it is a reminder that the very thing they love, the very thing they have worshiped, the very thing they have tried to save, he is going to use to bring judgment to them. Does it not take your mind back to a day when the children of Israel were in slavery in Egypt, and God sent Moses into Egypt to bring 10 plagues? And those plagues, if you don't know, it's an incredible study. Those plagues, things that were happening on the Nile River, to the fertility and the livestock and the crops and the sun and all that stuff, every one of those 10 plagues were strikes against the gods they worshipped in the earth. And so in a very similar way, as we think about the return of Christ, these judgments, these 7 trumpets that blow, and these first 4 that affect the earth are almost as if the very things that they trusted in, that they worshiped and they really sought to save, God is going to use those very things as an instrument to destroy those who don't know him. That's what this section unfolds for us. Now let's walk real quickly through those woes as we wrap up our time. There's 4 woes that come with the trumpets, or 4 judgments. The first one is in verse 7. The first sounded, and there came hail and fire mixed with blood, and they were thrown to the earth, and a third of the earth was burned up, and a third of the trees were burned up, and all the green grass was burned up. So the first trumpet impacts the earth's surface, right? This is the grass, the trees, those things. And you might want to just circle somewhere in your Bible, and you'll see it as you read through the rest of the trumpets here, the first 4. There's this constant reminder of 1/3. 1/3 of the earth was burned up, a third of the trees, and all the green grass was burned up. All the way down to verse 12, you keep reading about a third being used. It's almost in every verse. It shows us that these are not random events, right? It's not like, this just kind of happened on the earth. This is kind of like a very designed divine judgment of specific proportions and results. It also reminds us that this time for the lost is not as bad as it's going to get, because only a third will have happened at this point. When we get to trumpets 5 and 6, prior to the 7th, when the trumpet blows and Christ returns, it is going to be judgment and wrath in the earth like they have never imagined. The second trumpet, verses 8 and 9. The second angel sounded, and something like a great mountain burning with fire was thrown into the sea, and a third of the sea became blood, and a third of the creatures which were in the sea and had life died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. Impacts here, this one, the second trumpet, on the earth's oceans. So the surface of the earth has been scorched. Now the waters, the oceans, the large bodies of water. And notice I will want to point out to you in verse 8 that he uses a word that reminds me that this mountain burning like a great mountain, the word like probably is a reminder that this is a simile. This is an illustration. This is a type. This is the best way John can describe what he's seeing there in this revelation. There was something like a great mountain burning with fire. Maybe it is an asteroid. I don't know. Maybe it is some huge piece of stone that comes down to hit the waters. Maybe. We don't know. One scientist explained it this way. He said, if such a rock came toward the earth, the friction of the earth's atmosphere would cause it to burn. Astronomers are even today calculating the orbits of known asteroids to see if any of them would come close enough to strike the earth. If one happened to land in the ocean, it could easily produce tidal waves 1,000 feet high, which then doesn't make it hard to understand how ships are even being wrecked in the oceans. In addition, what John records here in this verse is both a natural and a divine miracle that takes place. He says, and the waters turned to blood. The waters turned to blood. The sea became, as it were, just blood. The Greek word for blood there, interesting word, as I looked through that this week, gives us the root word, our English root word, hema, from which we get hematology, the study of blood. And what do you say? This is literal, really blood that has filled this place. And this is kind of reminiscent of the plagues of Egypt, in which God turned the water in the Nile into blood in Exodus 7. So if someone were to ask me, do you think that's just kind of imagery? I don't think in the 10 plagues it was imagery. There's no reason to think this is imagery at this point. These are things that are actually in the earth that people have loved and worshiped and adored, and it's been going on forever. Earth Day is not a new thing. It's gone on forever in one sense or form in the heart of men. We read about it in Romans 1, loving the creation more than the Creator. But when this day comes, this love for what they have trusted in keeps falling apart, keeps coming undone. Ships are destroyed, tidal waves, there's stench of blood, things dying in the ocean, and ships wrecking. So God has scorched the earth that man has worshipped. And now, if you just go back and study enough of mythologies and beliefs that people have about things, the very sea from which they believe life comes from has now been destroyed. A third of it has been attacked. The third trumpet, verses 10 and 11. The third angel sounded, and a great star fell from heaven, burning like a torch, and it fell on a third of the rivers and on the springs of waters. The name of the star is called Wormwood, and a third of the waters became wormwood, and many men died from the waters because they were made bitter. They were made bitter. That word torch there is a word lampos, like a torch or something, a lamp. And it could refer, I'm guessing, it could refer to a star that comes from heaven. Whereas in the second trumpet, it was like a boulder, a stone that hit the water. In this case, it is like a disintegrating star that sparks and has, as it were, spewing things flying from it. could be that from that comes fiery, poisonous debris. As that's a real possibility, as he refers to it as wormwood, which in the Old Testament is a constant reminder through the prophets that judgment has come. It's a bitter tasting thing. Wormwood is something that was bitter tasting. It grew in their land. And anytime you wanted to refer to something that was a bitter, horrible experience, you'd use wormwood. And so here this third angel sounds his trumpet, and it brings such bitterness to the earth. Whereas the first trumpet scorched the earth, the second trumpet impacted the oceans, this one now has impacted the rivers and the lakes. And finally, the fourth trumpet, verse 12. The fourth angel sounded, and a third of the sun and a third of the moon and a third of the stars were struck, so that a third of them would be darkened, and the day would not shine for a third of it, and the night in the same way. Here, this fourth trumpet, as it blows, begins to impact the sun, the moon, and the stars. Kind of reminds you, doesn't it, of the days in which the plagues came into Egypt and there was a portion of the land that actually was darkened as a sign of God's judgment. Now, those are not hard to understand. They're not really complicated to unpack. It's God's judgment coming through the world, which the world has loved and worshiped and sought to draw its life from, and now the very thing that actually they have been worshiping and adoring has now become the tool that destroys their world and their life. And God uses it to do that. I think as we kind of conclude and we come to this end of this chapter this morning, I want you to notice what verse 13 says. Then I looked, having heard these four trumpets blow, and I heard an angel flying in mid-heaven saying with a loud voice, "Woe, woe, woe to those who dwell on the earth because of the remaining blast of the trumpet of the three angels who are about to sound." In other words, as bad as this has been in the first four trumpets, there's three more, and it's only going to get worse. And so as we think about really the world in which we live in and the days that really has become a worship of the creation rather than the Creator, I think there's a couple things that are on my mind here as I think about this in conclusion. There is coming a day. When that day is, we don't know. We've never set a time on that, but there is coming a day when there will be no more Earth Day. There'll be no more worship of the earth. There'll be no more seeking to save the world. That day will come. And that day will come as we draw near to the coming of Christ. And it definitely will be a reminder to them that they have been worshiping the wrong thing. The wrong one, I should say. In that day, listen to this very carefully, though I'm sure seminars will be held. People will still be trying to not use styrofoam and any number of other things to stay green. In that day, that really won't matter anymore, will it? Because in that day, it's not what you've done to try to rescue the earth that matters. In that day, what will matter is, have you turned to the God who alone can rescue you from the wrath that is to come? And so as we think, listen, brothers and sisters, about this tribulation period that the book of Revelation just keeps unfolding more and more for us about. As we think about those seals and we think about we are sealed and we are protected and we are safe from the wrath that is to come, there's another side that ought to be going on in our soul as well, and that is those who don't know Christ are not protected. They are not safe from the wrath to come. And really, as much as they really want to try to save their world and do all they can and make it a priority, they are in eternal danger as this day comes. Because there is no escaping apart from Christ. Just as when we saw the seals and Christ returns, only his people are safe. So when the final trumpet blows, only his people are going to be safe. So as much as on the one hand we have great delight and joy in the reign of God and the protection that he provides for us as his people, and keeping us safe right to the very end and causing us to reign with him. How is the other side of that going on in your soul? The struggle over those who don't know Christ. You know, it's the people that when you leave church today that you may see who really have given no thought of God and the gospel at all. What does that do in your soul when you look them in the eye and you go about life with them? Does it somehow bring to you a sense of sorrow and grief? If you look at them and you look at family members and you look at those that you interact in this world with, and it doesn't really kind of weigh on your soul, we're missing part of what we're supposed to be thinking about in between the first and the second coming of Christ. Now listen, you know very well that we are not in any way the ones that's going to save any person. Only God can save a sinner. He's chosen to use us as instruments in his hands, as tools to do one thing, and that is to proclaim the gospel. A gospel is not a complicated message. It's a message that says that every one of us have been born into this world are born sinners. We've all sinned. We've all fallen short of God's glory. We're totally not like him. And God, because we are sinners and he is righteous, must judge and punish sin. But this is where the good news comes in, right? Rather than God giving us what we deserved in his justice, he gives us what we don't deserve in his mercy and his grace. And his mercy and his grace is displayed in that he looks at you and he says concerning you that everything you have done has done nothing but pile up the wages of your iniquity and your sin and his wrath. And if he gives you what you deserve, me, every one of us in this place, every one, not one, for all of us have fallen short of the glory of God, we're going to get eternal wrath and judgment forever. That day of his return would be a horrible day for us were it not for the good news, that he gave us something out of his mercy and his grace. And that mercy and his grace is displayed at the cross. For at the cross where I first received my sight and the burden of my sin rolled away, it was there by faith that I received my sight. And yes, in the right biblical way, I am now happy all the days. Because there at the cross, I am reminded that what God did is he put someone in my place to bear my sin and the wrath I deserved. He took his spotless son and he gave him to be the substitute, the one who would actually bear the full fury and wrath that not only my sin, but the sin of an entire world would deserve. And he bore that wrath that whoever would believe, whoever put their trust in what he has done, living a life that you never lived, which was perfect, and then dying the death you should have died, doing that in our place and putting my hope, my eternal trust and confidence in him other than anything I could do, putting my hope in him is what will rescue me from the wrath. We know that. But those who don't know Christ, they've not believed that. And nothing they're going to do is going to save their world or their life in that day. So as we think about what is our joy, what is our glory, what is our delight, how much of your heart is really burdened and lingering for making Christ known to people who don't know him? You cannot save him. God saves sinners. You are an instrument in his redeeming hand to proclaim that good news. But only God saves. And he has chosen. You say, well, he could save them if he wants to. He doesn't need me to save them. That he could. But he has chosen in his sovereignty and ordained that the way he will save them is by you speaking the gospel and sharing the truth with them. So, as we think of tribulation, we think of trials that will come, that ought to be something that weighs on our souls about those who don't know Christ. And then in that burden, let that be something that drives us to really open our mouth, hand them that tract, pray for them to come to understand the gospel. I'm afraid, church, that sometimes there's other things that trouble us more than that. Things we wanted to have in life we didn't get, and we're just so troubled. Things that we hoped would happen in a relationship that didn't happen, and we are so troubled. Things that we wanted to go do and it never happened, and we are so troubled. And aren't those just trivial troubles, really? We even get so troubled about our health and our bodies, and they're falling apart, and yes, they are. But rather than reminding us, that means I am mortal and God is immortal. He lives forever. I don't. And when I die, I am with him. We get so overwhelmed, and it becomes a burden that we bear. And it's, in light of what we're talking about today, it really is trivial. It's trivial. Oh, take care of your body. Take care of your things. Do what you're going to do. But don't let that be the trouble of your soul. The trouble of your soul is today, there's coming a day in which there are people who will face a God who has provided a way, but they have not received. And they have rejected, and they've worshiped something other than him. So make him known. Make him known. Let's pray.